Is it not on? I'm going to present to you another biblical dialogue sermon. And for those of you who have never sat through one of these, the rest of you be patient, and I'm going to go through my little spiel. What is dialogue? Dialogue is a written composition in which two or more persons are represented as conversing. It's a conversation between two or more people. It's an exchange of ideas and opinions. But this fourth definition is the one I really like to focus on when I present one of these. And that's the conversational element of literary or dramatic composition. I love dialogue, whether it's in a book, whether it's in a movie, whether it's in a television show. It can be informative and entertaining. It reveals to us the emotions and the perspectives of the characters. Within its context, there is often subtext. So sometimes we have to kind of read between the lines to determine what's implied by certain words or phrases, but sometimes we don't. Sometimes it's stated very directly and very emphatically, and it creates a verbal impact on us that gives us pause, and it causes us to stop and think. And the Bible is full of the best dialogues that have ever been recorded for mankind. Some of my favorites, Genesis chapter 3, the temptation and the interrogation of Adam and Eve. Exodus chapters 3 and 4, God's conscription of Moses into service. I love the book of Job. The entire book is one big dialogue, but particularly chapter 1. Any of the conversations of Jesus in the Gospels are just beautiful dialogues. These and many others are full of examples and lessons that need to be delved into for application and understanding. This particular idea for this lesson was given to me by Meredith Sink. After the last one I preached, she came up to me and she said, "Hey, you know what would be a really neat dialogue for you to do a lesson on?" And it's the one of Balaam and the donkey. And I was just dumbfounded. How had I never thought of that? I love that story. It takes place in one of my favorite settings and eras in the Old Testament, in Israelite history. So, if you would, turn to Numbers chapter 22. The text for our lesson will be verses 22 through 35. Now, before we get to that, let me give you a little backstory. Okay, at this point in Israel's history, they've completed their 40-year wandering through the wilderness. Why? Well, it was because the first time they arrived at the land of Canaan, what happened? They wouldn't go in. They were scared. But primarily is the fact that they did not trust in God to help them take the land. And as a result of that, then they were punished to wander for 40 years while generations of people died off until it was time for them to come back. At this point in time also, they've lost their first high priest, Aaron. He's already passed on. With God's help, they defeat the Canaanites at Hormah. And then at Mount Hor, we have the account where the people spoke out against God and Moses. And so God afflicted their camp with fiery or poisonous serpents. And then he instructed Moses to construct the image of a serpent, which Moses did out of bronze. And they erected it in the camp so that if you were bitten by one of these serpents, all you had to do was turn and look at that and you would be healed. Following that, they traveled into the territory of Moab. There they defeated King Sihon, who was king of the Amorites. And the reason was they had asked permission to pass through his territory peacefully, and he refused to give it to them. Following that, they encountered Og, who was king of Bashan. And we know from other accounts that Og was also a giant. Having done that, they set up camp in the plains of Moab. Balak, who was king of the Moabites at the time, was pretty wigged out by this mass of Israelites, by this invading nation. And the text at the beginning of chapter 22 says that he was exceedingly afraid and sick with dread. That's how bad the Moabites felt. And so Moab went and told Midian about what was going on. They grouped together, and King Balak sends them after a man named Balaam, who lived in another country, a distance off. So they seek him out. And what we have following, beginning in verses 7 through 21, and I'm not going to read all this, but they take a diviner's fee, they go and find Balaam and tell him that they want him to come back. He is someone who is renowned to them for his blessings and his curses. And apparently he is pretty impactful. And they want him to come back and curse Israel. And so he tells them in verse 8, stay here tonight, and I'll bring back word to you as to what the Lord tells me. So he consults the Lord. And the first thing out of the Lord's mouth is, don't go with them. You're not going to curse my people. So he goes back. He tells these emissaries what the word is, and they go back to King Balak. Balak doesn't accept that answer. And so he sends even more prominent and honorable men, princes of Moab, back to Balaam to entice him to come do this. So, again, he invites them to lodge. And he tells them in verse 18, though Balak were to give me his house full of silver and gold, I could not go beyond the word of the Lord my God to do more or less. Now, therefore, you stay here tonight, and I'll know what more the Lord will say to me. And so God appears to him again. And he says, if the men come to call you, rise and go with them, but only the word which I speak to you, that you shall do. And then it says Balaam rose and he left with the princes of Moab. Here's the thing I guess it never really struck me before until I was preparing for this lesson. What was Balaam's relationship with God? The short answer is, really, we don't know. We have no idea. According to Matthew Henry's commentary on this passage, Jewish writers were inclined to think that Balaam was a great prophet who was very accomplished in predictions and answers to his prayers. As to his interaction with God, it's interesting here in the text that that is not suggested as anything strange or new. So it's possible that God had viewed him with interest and use of him before this. We don't know. But that's a possibility. Regardless of that, Balaam is obviously a prophet with a paganistic mindset. I want you to consider this. If you look over in chapters 22 and 23, when Balaam finally meets up with King Balak, and he is going to attempt to call curses down on Israel, they operate under the impression that God is geographically influenced. And that was a big belief among idolaters at the time. Pagan gods were designated to certain or specific areas, and it was believed that that's where they held influence, that that's where their power resided. And so with each failed attempt at prophecy to curse the Israelites, Balak and Balaam go sacrificial site hopping, so to speak. They're like, well, okay, let's go over here and try it. And we're going to kill a bunch of animals, and nope, didn't work that time. Let's go over here and try it. That was their belief. Balaam is also referred to as one who practiced sorcery in chapter 24 and verse 1. This is a practice that God did not condone. And one of the interesting things there, if you read that verse, it says, now when Balaam saw that it pleased the Lord to bless Israel, he did not go out, as at other times, to seek to use sorcery, but he set his face toward the wilderness. This account here, this is going to be the third attempt. In the two previous attempts, after they had made sacrifices, he tells Balak, he's like, hang out right here. I'm going to walk off over here to consult God. The idea, I think, that is being presented is that he was going out to try to conjure up the Lord or cast an enchantment. He didn't need to. God appeared to him and spoke directly with him. So God kind of subverts that occult attempt, so to speak. Also, it's noted that he's a diviner. These agents of Balak came to him with a diviner's fee. But that's also denoted by the fact that it makes reference numerous times to the fact that he used an oracle, some means by which to receive his messages. And that was an occult practice. The first two occasions he attempted to curse Israel, when God appeared to him, the text in both instances says he put a word in Balaam's mouth. Yet afterwards, Balaam still tried to use the oracle. And he still prophesied the way God said that he would. It's almost like he was attempting to try to subvert God. God, in fact, subverts him. God, in fact, subverts any demonic influence that might be trying to relay a message or prophecy through that oracle to Balaam. And I love that. I absolutely love that. So it seems that Balaam's reputation was one that he had become famous, or rather he had become infamous. And as a result of that, he apparently grew proud and covetous. Thus, his greed was probably the best way to appeal to him. However, after receiving God's initial word on the matter, he continues to entertain the advances of Balak's emissaries. And eventually God consents to the matter with this caveat. Only speak the word I speak to you, that you will do. Now, we're set up. Let's look here at the text. Beginning in verse 22, it says, and then God's anger was aroused when he, that is Balaam, went. And the angel of the Lord took his stand in the way as an adversary against him. And he was riding on his donkey, and his two servants were with him. And now the donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way with his drawn sword in hand. And the donkey turned aside out of the way and went into the field. So Balaam struck the donkey to turn her back onto the road. And then the angel of the Lord stood in a narrow path between the vineyards, with a wall on this side and a wall on that side. And when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she pushed herself against the wall and crushed Balaam's foot against the wall. So he struck her again. And then the angel of the Lord went further and stood in a narrow place where there was no way to turn either to the right hand or to the left. And when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she lay down under Balaam. And he struck the donkey with his staff. And then the Lord opened the mouth of the donkey, and she said to Balaam, what have I done to you that you have struck me these 3 times? And Balaam said to the donkey, because you have abused me. I wish there was a sword in my hand, for now I would kill you. So the donkey said to Balaam, Am I not your donkey on which you have ridden ever since I became yours to this day? Was I ever disposed to do this to you? And he said, No. And then the Lord opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way with his drawn sword in his hand. And he bowed his head and fell flat on his face. And the angel of the Lord said to him, Why have you struck your donkey these 3 times? Behold, I come out to stand against you, because your way is perverse before me. The donkey saw me and turned aside from me these 3 times. If she had not turned aside from me, surely I would have killed you by now and let her live. And Balaam said to the angel of the Lord, I have sinned, for I didn't know you stood in the way against me. Now therefore, if it displeases you, I'll turn back. Then the angel of the Lord said to Balaam, Go with the men, but only the word that I speak to you, that you shall speak. So Balaam went with the princes of Balak. I love this. The only other instance that I can think of, and y'all can correct me afterwards, in which an animal is verbose, speaks, is in the Garden of Eden. Other than that, it's this. Beginning with the elements of the dialogue, we have the donkey. And she is meek. She says, What have I done wrong that you would strike me these 3 times? The fact of the matter is, nothing. The animal actually took the initiative to save her owner's life. She didn't freak out and start running amok. She didn't try to buck Balaam off and run away, leaving him to his fate. The worst thing she did was accidentally crush his foot against a wall. And that was in the effort to avoid a sword-wielding angel. Even now, it is she that lies humbly accepting her master's abuse. She's done nothing that was wrong. Balaam doesn't want to hear it. He's just mad. You abused me. If I had a sword right now, I'd kill you. The Hebrew word used for abused is alal. And it means to act severely, to make a fool of someone. It's not that she really hurt his foot, and she probably did. Imagine the size of a donkey crushing your foot up against a rock wall. Can't feel good. That's not the abuse he's talking about, though, is it? In other words, Balaam feels like his donkey has willfully ignored his direction and guidance. And in doing so, she's making him look bad, especially to the entourage that Balak has sent. However, wishing that he had the means on the spot, and she very humbly challenges him on that. She is mild-mannered. She says, look, essentially, you've had me for a long time. Have I ever behaved this way towards you? And begrudgingly, he has to admit, no. No, she hadn't. Donkeys, mules, burros, that branch of the equine family has a reputation for having stubborn and contrary demeanors. They can be downright uncooperative and aggravating. Ornery is the word associated with them often. But this donkey's defense is that she has never, ever behaved that way. You get that? That's completely out of character for that kind of animal, don't you think? And she has served him dutifully since the day that he's had her. Of the two, it's Balaam that's being abusive and stubborn. It's not the donkey. And then the angel of the Lord appears, manifested, with manifested meaning. And Balaam's reaction is to bow his head and then prostrate himself on the ground. He's placed himself essentially in the same humbled position that his donkey was beneath him. Why did you strike your donkey 3 times? The angel of the Lord asked. In other words, that was the wrong thing to do. Then the angel tells him, I've come out to stand against you because your way is perverse to me. The Hebrew word that is used there for stand against is Satan. Satan, which is defined as adversary. We see that term used up in verse 22 when it specifically states, the Lord took his stand in the way as an adversary, as a foe, an opponent. And when he says, your way is perverse to me, the Hebrew word there is yarat. It means reckless and contrary, like a donkey. Even though God had consented to let Balaam go, along with Balak's emissaries, that does not mean that he condoned it. You need to realize that. In verse 12 of the chapter, God very distinctly told the prophet, you shall not go with them. And more of them return. Let me go check with the Lord one more time and see what he says. Did he need to do that? No. He had his answer to begin with. Don't go with them. So Balaam, when this second group arrived, he should have just sent them packing. Look, guys, I told you. Can't go. See ya. Be careful on your ride back. No, instead he says, let me check with the Lord again. He should have sent them packing, but he didn't because he wanted to go. And him saying, even if Balak were to give me his house full of gold and silver, I've always kind of wondered if that was a little wink, wink, nudge, nudge kind of thing. Like, guys might ought to up my diviner's fee a little bit if you expect me to pull this off. I don't know. It just seems a strange thing to kind of work into the conversation there. If you know me, you know I love irony. And what's the irony here? What did Balaam tell his donkey that he wished he could do? If I had a sword, I'd kill you right now. What does the angel tell him? If your donkey hadn't turned aside, I would have struck you down with my sword. I love that. What's Balaam's reaction? He mollifies. That is not a term that you hear often, that you use nowadays. And what it means is to appease the anger or the anxiety of someone. the angel of the Lord is definitely angry. And Balaam knows that. And he wants to smooth this over very quickly. And he confesses, I have sinned. And it almost seems like the way the text reads, that he thinks his sin is not knowing that the angel of the Lord was present and blocking his way. Kind of like, sorry, I didn't see you there. But that's not it. He realizes. And he says, if it displeases you, I'll turn back. If? Really? Dude, it's the angel of the Lord standing before you with a drawn sword. There's no if. He's displeased. See, if Balaam had taken God at his word the first time, he wouldn't be in this predicament right now. Still, he's being contrite. He's being repentant. And so the angel of the Lord gives him a mandate. Go with the men and only speak the word I tell you to speak. That aspect hadn't changed, but he is driving the point home to this prophet. He consents to let Balaam go along, King Balak. I imagine that the richer Balaam's diviner fee was, the more favorable or terrible his blessings and curses were. Didn't matter. This time, he's going to prophesy in such a way that it brings greater glory to God and to Israel, his people. Consider the characters of the dialogue. You've got the donkey, typically a symbol of stubbornness, but in this case, it proves to be a source of salvation. Her behavior would seem to be a clue, an indication that there's something wrong. Balaam, he proves to be the stubborn one. He receives his initial answer from God, yet persists in entertaining the desire of King Balak and his emissaries. Balaam's behavior is that of a man who ignores his own obvious warning signs, which is ironic considering he's a prophet. You would think that he should have been the one to pick up on that, but he doesn't. God emphatically states his will. That never changes, people. Yet, he is permissive as it serves his purpose. And there are many instances recorded for us in Scripture where God allows that, where he lets someone have their way or pursue their want, yet he drives home the point that there are repercussions to those who are headstrong in pursuing their own will and not his. You see, sometimes people are like donkeys, right? And you just got to give them their head, let them go their way, and suffer the ramifications of their decisions and their actions. It's the only way they get it. It's the only way they learn. And unfortunately, sometimes they don't. I've had some tough lessons in life, and it took more than one stupid headstrong decision before I got it. That's Balaam. So ultimately, what was Balaam's fate? Well, you look in Numbers chapter 20 and 24, On 4, blesses Israel instead of cursing them, much to King Balak's chagrin, and that's putting it mildly. Balak was not happy with him. In Numbers 25, at the very beginning of that chapter, we have the incident at Peor. Moabite women are used to tempt Israelite men to commit harlotry, both physically and spiritually, at Balaam Peor. That resulted in the deaths of 24,000 Israelites. You look over in Numbers chapter 31. During the war, Israel's war with the Midianites, you have to remember they were kind of part and parcel of all this deal too. In verse 8, it says, they killed the kings of Midian with the rest of the kings who were killed, Evi, Rechem, Zur, Hur, and Reba, the 5 kings of Midian. Balaam, the son of Beor, they also killed. How? With the sword. There's irony for you. I love that. But ultimately, why? Look over in verse 16. The Israelites have taken captives, specifically women. And Moses confronts them, and he says, look, these women caused the children of Israel, through the counsel of Balaam, to trespass against the Lord in the incidents of Peor. And there was a plague among the congregation of the Lord. You see, Balaam further demonstrated his stubbornness to ultimately appease the Moabites and the Midianites rather than God. If he could not circumvent God's will directly, then he would find a way to do it indirectly. And he came up with that strategy. And it worked. He knew what he was doing. So what's the conclusion? What's the takeaway from this sermon? Plain and simple. It's this. And I've made this point in sermons before, and I always try to drive it home whenever I'm teaching the high school class. Because everybody needs to get this. Probably me more than most. That's big enough you can't help but read it. Stubbornness is spiritual suicide. You assent, you accede, you agree to the will of God, whether you like it or not. Because God's will supersedes everything. Our theme this year is it's all about Him. You can't be stubborn and still expect to live in a way that you think you're representing it's all about God. You're not. You're being selfish. You're being stubborn. You're being ornery, is what it boils down to. Don't do that. God's will is going to happen. The smart thing to do is consent to that, is to submit to that, to get behind that, humble yourself to that. And let God have His way. Let God have His way with you. And if you haven't done that, take advantage of it. And don't wait. Don't dally. This is a great time to obey the Lord. Name the name of His Son, Jesus. Recognize God as the only true and living God. That only salvation comes through the death of Jesus, through being baptized to arise a new creature, walking in newness of life, serving Him until He returns. And it may be that, like me sometimes, you get stubborn about things. You don't heed God's will and instruction. You want to go your own way. You want to have your head and do what you want to do. Don't do that. And if you've sinned in some public manner that has brought reproach upon His name, please come forward. Let us pray for you. Or even at that, seek out one of the elders privately. It doesn't matter. What matters is make your relationship right with God, and don't be stubborn about it as we stand and sing.